to be true.
You just have to pray for everybody.
Don't know about that or not. But he said he didn't. He said he didn't hardly believe him. I said, you better.
You ready to start
It looks
recording?
serious to me.
Yeah, go ahead.
He said, what could I do about it? And I said, don't worry about it. He said, see there.
Okay, in your handout, we're on page 43. Capital letter F. Is anything too hard for the Lord? We'll go back and we'll look at a little bit earlier just to catch up, because this is where the men are with Abram, and they made the comment to Abraham that his wife would be having a child, and she laughed. And so we'll go back a little bit and look at that. Probably begin about verse 9. And just read that and catch up to verse 13 through 15 is what I want to discuss tonight. Of course, all of you know that Gene is in War Acres nursing home right now. We'll probably be there for a couple of weeks, so if you get a chance to go see him, I know he'd appreciate that, because he gets lonely. And he's very alert and everything, and he told me the other night he got up, said the alarm didn't work on the bed, and he got up by himself and got in trouble. But that's Gene. He's very independent and wants to get up and walk, and I certainly understand that. Maxine, please keep her in your prayers.
She's here tonight.
She's coming.
She is tonight. Well, fantastic.
She's getting out
I
of
knew
the
she was
car.
getting better, so that's fantastic. Jack McBride is having a tough time. He's now diagnosed with pneumonia, so we certainly want to keep Jack in your prayers. And, of course, Pat. I don't know of anybody else at this time. Hello, Maxine. Good to see you tonight.
Thank you.
You didn't have to bring me a card, though.
What did you think it was for you? It could have been for me.
Well, it could have been for you, but I'm making an
Somebody
assumption.
said they started with M, so it's not for me either.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Name didn't look long enough to be mine, so it probably get to me.
That's not for me either, I know that. So if you have your handouts, it's on page 43. If not, that's okay, because I will keep you up to date of where we are. Let's begin with a prayer. Our most loving Heavenly Father, we thank Thee so much for this day and for the many blessings You've given us. We thank Thee, Father, for the moisture that we received. We're thankful, Father, that there was not any more injuries than there were in the tornadoes last night. And we ask that You would be with those individuals, that they might be comforted, that they might be able to get back to a normal lifestyle. And we're thankful, Father, for each and every member of this congregation, for the effort that we put forth to encourage one another. And we ask that You would be with us, that we would always work to increase the spiritual growth here, that there might be increased numbers as well. We're thankful for our upcoming gospel meeting, and we ask that You would be with Brother Russ and his family as they journey here to be with us, that it would be a successful gospel meeting, that each one of us will labor to make it successful. And we're thankful, Father, that we can be able to study Thy Word without fear of persecution. We ask that You would be with us as we continue our study in the book of Genesis, that we might have a full understanding of the messianic line and those things You expect us to know, that we can be the kind of Christians that You want us to be. These things we ask in Jesus Christ's holy name. Amen. Let's see. Make sure I turn. Didn't. Now I've turned my mic on. All right. So let's begin at verse 9. And Ron, would you mind reading through verse 15 for me, please?
Then they said to him, "Where is Sarah your wife?" So they said, "Here in the tent." And he said, "I'll certainly return to you according to the time of life. But behold, Sarah your wife shall have a son." Sarah was listening to the tent door which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I'm grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I surely bear a child since I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I'll return to you according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, no, but you did laugh.
Okay. I may have missed it, but we are in Genesis chapter 18, so I apologize if I didn't get that across. Now, what I want you to appreciate, remember now, how old is Abraham at this time? How old? 99. Sarah was how old? 89. It's important to remember that, because remember when we talked about Abraham laughing, Abraham bowed and laughed, and we talked about the fact that his laughter was not a laughter of I'm not capable, but his laughter was a laughter of joy, and he was humbling himself in the sight of the Lord, you might say, bowing because God had promised him that he would have a seed that would come from his loins, and that seed would be continue the messianic line. We get to Sarah, though, and Sarah is 10 years younger than Abraham. So Sarah's 89. Now, if you think about that, you ladies especially, but we men understand this as well, Sarah was well past childbearing age. Probably had gone through menopause, and so in her mind, there's no way that she could have a child. The problem is that Sarah had forgot in the faith in the Lord. So the idea is that if we look at 13 through 15, the idea is that we cannot conceal things from the Lord. Sarah must have felt a shock when this stranger, who could not see her, knew that she laughed. Remember, Sarah's in the tent now. These strangers were outside the tent. She laughs inside the tent, and so now she probably was a little bit shocked, because obviously the stranger knew her heart, since he could not see her facial expression nor hear the chuckle. Afraid and befuddled, Sarah seeks to cover herself by lying to the one who knew of her laughter. This is most likely the reason why her laugh is more widely known than the laugh of Abraham. God's brief rebuttal stamps her response as unworthy of further consideration. So you won't see anything else about this laugh other than the fact that in verse 15 she denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid, and he said, no, but you did laugh. All right? Any questions or comments through verse 15? Yes, Donna.
I had a question on, I know in earlier times when men lived, hundreds and hundreds and almost 1,000 years, the women got to the same thing where they aged a lot longer than they do now. And so maybe their childbearing was longer back then.
Well, keep in mind, after the flood, though, lifespan shortened significantly.
Yeah, but before that, though, when the lifespan was longer, that means women's lifeline was, they were bear children.
That is correct.
Okay.
Yes, that is correct. Before the flood, because remember what God said to Adam and Eve, go forth and replenish the earth, multiply and replenish the earth.
Which is what people,
And this is exactly what people did prior to Noah. It was still expected after Noah, but their lifespan began to shorten after Noah. And so Abraham, how old was Abraham when he died? 175. Now, but keep in mind, how old was Methuselah? 969. 969.
Abraham's dad was 205.
Abraham's dad was 205.
Sarah knew him.
Huh?
And Sarah knew him.
Sarah knew him. So their lifespan is getting shorter and shorter. So in Sarah's mind, she's waiting, and that's what she says here. After I have grown old, in verse 12, shall I have pleasure, my Lord, being old also. But men can continue to produce children at an old age. But women, there is a time in our current time, men can still produce children, but women cannot because of their age. Do what, Mary?
He married again
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Abraham married again and had more children.
That's true. He did. He did. And we'll get to that. And so I appreciate you saying that. All right. So look at verse 16 then, specifically. Debbie, you want to read verse 16 for me?
Then the men rose from there and looked towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to send them on the way.
Okay. So having completed the first part of their journey then, i.e. assuring Sarah of her impending pregnancy, the men set out on the second part of their journey. And that was to inspect the cities of the Jordan Valley. God will remain behind and talk to Abraham while the angels travel to Sodom. Go and look at Genesis chapter 19. I didn't put it up there. But look at verse 1. It says, Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. Remember, there were three men that came to Abraham. God stayed behind. These two angels went on forward to Sodom. Okay? Any comments or questions on verse 16? Yes, John?
There must have been something different about their appearance because Abraham and Lot both recognized not maybe who they were, but what they were.
Yeah. Don't know what that difference was, but obviously. And part of that had to do with, remember, Lot was a faithful individual as well. They both left their homeland together to get away from idolatry. And so they had a strong faith. And like you say, there must have been something different. Let's look at verses 17 through 19. John, read that for me if you will. And by the way, that's capital letter H and I in your handout.
17 through what?
19.
And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, and the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of him.
Okay, so this dialogue between the Lord and Abraham is for Abraham's benefit at this point. And it was designed to challenge him to act wisely and nobly for justice. The following scene, where Abraham dares to be Sodom's intercessor before God, plays off of this sense where God dares to adopt Abraham as his confidant. You remember a little bit later, Abraham is asking God, well, if there's so many people, will you spare Sodom? And we'll look at that a little bit later. But verse 19 here shows clearly how grace and law work together. Look at that verse again, where it says, For I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him. So it opens with grace. I have known him. Directed towards the firm discipline of law. Command, way, justice, and judgment. Okay? Through which eventually grace may reach its goal. RSV version says it like this, that the Lord may bring what he has promised. So we see the phrase that he may command his children and his household. Ultimately, the purpose of God's telling this to Abraham is to ensure that Abraham would teach his children about the righteousness of God and the perils of wickedness. So then you see the phrase there in 19, righteousness and justice. In other words, to do all things that are good and right and just, both to God and men. Look at Psalm 119 and verse 121. Pat, do you have that? That's okay, when you get there. Psalm 119, verse 21. 121.
121.
Yeah, 121. I might have said 21.
3 or 4 pages over.
121.
121, yes,
I
please.
have done justice and righteousness. Do not leave me to my oppressors.
And that's exactly what God is saying to Abraham now. Do justice, do righteousness to both God and to man. And in essence, that's what is expected of us as His children as well, to do righteousness and to do justice. Any comments through verse 19 or questions?
I'm kind of wondering why the Lord's speaking and He's saying the Lord, He's using Himself in, third person kind of thing.
What verse are you looking at?
Well, all through there, what we just read.
Well, verse 20, we just read through verse 19, but in verse 20 it says, "And the Lord said,"
For I have known Him in order that we may commend that they keep the way of the Lord. Is that Abraham talking, or? I mean, that's 19, so.
no, that "for I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord." That's God speaking there and saying, this is what I expect of Abraham.
It's just interesting that He's saying, instead of my way, He's saying, keep the way of the Lord.
Yeah. But that is the way of the Lord instead of... I understand what you're saying. It is my way too, but it's the way of the Lord, which when you look at it, the way of the Lord is expected of all of His children, not just Abraham. Because God's way is judgment and righteousness, or justice and righteousness. So, but yeah, I appreciate that question and that comment. So, any other thoughts?
Well, NIV says, "For I have chosen him." To me, that seems a little clearer.
I have chosen him. Yeah. Okay. All right. Any other thoughts? Yes,
You gotta
John.
remember, this was wrote later, several hundred years later,
Yes.
and it's to bring the people that was wrote for, which is the children of Israel, up to date, basically up to date with what they're supposed to be doing.
Right. Yeah.
And
Okay.
how they got to where they're doing.
Yeah. All right. Good point. Good point. Any other thoughts? All right. Let's look then at verses 20 and 21. And Maxine, do you have that? In your handout, it'd be capital letter J. Sin ultimately brings the judgment of God, and that's what I put up there. Same thing.
And the Lord said, "Because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is come unto me, and if not, I will know."
Okay, now remember the two angels are already there. Now God's saying He will go down as well. Do what? Three angels?
There's three people, three entities there.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is there's two that went earlier to Sodom, and now the Lord is going. So there'll be three.
He's telling Abraham what he's going to do. There's
Right.
at Abraham's tent, and there's three.
Three with Abraham? We read earlier where two went on down to Sodom. And God stayed back with Abraham to continue to talk to him.
Where'd you read that at?
Verse 22.
Yeah, verse 22.
Then the men turned away from there and went out toward Sodom, but Abram stood still before the Lord. Okay?
It says the men rose up from thence and looked toward Sodom. It don't say they went anywhere. It says they just looked that direction.
Your version is King James. I'm
Yeah.
reading from New King James, and New King James says, and went toward Sodom.
Taking 20 steps is going toward.
Okay. All right. Won't disagree with you, John. All right, so in your handout, you're looking at capital letter J, okay? And the idea is that sin ultimately brings the judgment of God. So to say that sin is crying out to heaven is an emphatic way of saying that they are calling for divine intervention. It is certain that God did not need to go down to the cities to know the level of wickedness there in Sodom and Gomorrah, though this follows what he did before his last instance of divine judgment. Going back to Genesis chapter 11, and verses 5 and 7. Donna, you had that?
The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. Come, let us go down and there confuse our language, so they will not understand one another's speech.
Okay, so instead then God chooses to display that he, as just judge of all the earth, does nothing without first being in full possession of all facts. God is shown as having the qualities of an ideal judge in this situation. We see God is merciful by preference, nor hasty to condemn. God will indeed investigate and know for certain, but if it is indeed so, then God will act, and act drastically. God did not need to gather evidence, because he has already said that the facts of the case have come up before him. Rather, he does this to illustrate this point to Abraham and ultimately to us as well. Any thoughts through verse 21? All right, look at the last verse then. Verse 22. Mary, you had that?
The man turned away and went toward Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord.
Okay, and that's capital letter K in your handout. Abraham stood yet before the Lord, and so can we, is what your handout says. This verse read with, if you look at Genesis chapter 18, verse 2, where it says, So he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him, and when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the ground. And you look at Genesis chapter 19, verse 1, it says, Now the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. So you go back and look at 22, it says, Then the men turned away from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. So this verse read with these 2 verses make it evident that the 3 journeymen were God and 2 angels. Appropriately, 2 go to confirm the crime, so later in Mosaic law, 2 witnesses are needed for capital punishment. God, however, does not depart. Ultimately, the whole passage displays God's approachability, I should say, to such a servant as Abraham. And he is approachable by us through prayer. Any comments on verse 22? All right, look at verse 23, which would be capital letter L in your handout, and it says, What is the answer to Abraham's question in 18:23? He asked God, Wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? So let's look at verse 23. Karen?
And Abraham drew near and said, Wilt thou consume the righteous with the wicked?
So, what is the answer to Abraham's question? We'll look at some of those verses in just a minute, but God has not yet said that he would destroy the cities. Only that he was going to see if the report of their wickedness was true. Abraham, however, drew that conclusion based on his knowledge of God and his knowledge about Sodom and Gomorrah. The extent of their wickedness was most likely known to the whole region. So Abraham proceeds in a spirit of faith, of humility, and of love, demonstrated in his concern for the whole city, not for his kinsmen alone. Remember, Lot and his kinsmen are there. Yes, John?
Abraham had already had dealings with them.
Yes, yes. So he knew what Sodom and Gomorrah was like. So Abraham proposes that the future of everyone be determined not by the wicked ones in the midst of the community, but by the righteous ones. This is what God always does You go and you look at Rahab in Joshua chapter 2, and I don't really want to read that whole thing. Assyria and Jonah chapter 3 and 4, and then Israel in Ezekiel chapter 14 verses 12 through 20. That's also a fairly long reading. But if you were to read those various passages, you could indeed see that God always separates the righteous from the wicked. Okay? But this is Abraham's second intervention for Sodom. In Genesis 14 and verse 14, you go back and you look at the first intervention, Genesis 14 and verse 14. And here he says, "Now when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house and went in pursuit as far as Dan." Yeah, I may have written down the wrong scripture.
Is that where he took them in and Lot was captive?
Yeah, Lot was captive, and Abraham went to get his family released. And I didn't. Yeah, this was Abraham's second intervention in 18 for Sodom. The first intervention was there, like you say, Mary. I had lost my train of thought, but like you say, he went to free Lot at that time. Any questions through 23?
How much time has passed between that?
I really don't know. I hadn't thought about that, but that's a good question.
Lot left to Abraham.
Yeah, I didn't think about that, but that's a good question. I'd have to, I don't know. Do you know, Ron, how much time?
No, not without figuring it up.
I can certainly do that and go back and figure it up, John.
I think Lot was in all that for that length of time.
Yeah. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but that's a good question. I'll be glad to look that up and figure it out for you. It's a good question. All right, so look at verse 24. This is not in your handout because your handout goes to verse 25. So let's just read verses 24 and 25 together. Ron, would you read those for me, please?
Suppose there were 50 righteous within the city. Would you also destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous that were in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous for the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?
Okay, so Abraham's beginning to basically negotiate with God, if you want to use that phrase, but he begins one of the most famous scenes that we will ever read in the Bible. This is where a man is bargaining with God over how many righteous people it would take for God to spare a city. Okay? His first question that he asked was, would you destroy the whole city, both good and evil? Now he's breaking it down. Okay, what if there's 50 good here? So Abraham, in essence, moves down to 45. Then he moves to 40. Then he moves to 30, to 20. And finally he gets down to 10. And so at each instance, God agrees that he will not destroy the city if there are that many righteous people in it. Why would Abraham do this?
He wants to save Lot.
Do what?
He has relatives there.
Well, he had relatives there.
I think he knows that God is a just God and he can trust him.
Okay.
It wouldn't be fair to destroy the ones that are fallen.
That's very true. Think about this. The answer lies in the fact that Abraham was made in whose image? God's image. We are all created in God's image, okay? So a righteous man made in God's image would do what? He would do the right thing. He would seek to do the things that God would do. And so Abraham's asking some questions. So however is not Abraham is not privy to all the information that God is specifically privy to, and that is specifically how few righteous there were in Sodom. Abraham didn't know how few righteous there were. God did. So he must be shown the answer that God already knows. You had a comment,
I
John?
just always thought it was interesting. The first two drops was 5 and 5,
Yeah,
and then it went 10 and 10.
yeah,
And if it had went 5 again, he still wouldn't have had the little enough number
that's right. Yeah,
because there'd been one shy.
yeah.
I just always thought that was interesting.
It is interesting. It's important for us to see the free address of faith in this. Okay? Abraham does not hold back when it comes to his relationship with God. And that's a good example for us. We should not hold back. God is our Creator. He is our Heavenly Father. And so we should freely desire to go to Him. Just as we would our earthly father and mother, we should want to go to Him. So we see this here, that Abraham is not holding back in his conversation with God. He says, in fact, what is on his mind. It would have done him no good to hold back, as God already knew Abraham's thoughts. If Abraham had tried to hide it from God, he would have only been dishonest with himself and with God. So why did God let this happen? Now, as you said, you found it interesting that Abraham's dropping down 5 and 5. You know, you'd think that maybe God would say, enough. You know, if there's some innocent souls there, I'll spare the city. If not, then the city will be destroyed. Period.
Well, God knew what was there.
Okay. Exactly right. God already knew what was there, John.
God did spare the righteous ones out of the city.
He did spare the righteous ones.
At least he gave him a chance to be.
Here's the most important thing that I want you to appreciate is that God in this situation is not being influenced by Abraham. But in this discussion, God's position is not being altered. What He is doing, though, is proving Abraham's statement of verse 25, which says, "Far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" And that's what he's doing there. He's proving Abraham's statement of verse 25, that statement is a true statement. And the idea is that God is not an unjust God. That God goes to great lengths to show that truth, and it is important to see that God is not displeased with Abraham because Abraham's asking these questions. He does, after all, grant Abraham's petition each time. You remember that. Abraham said, "What? If there's just 45, will you spare the city?" "Yeah, I'll do that." "If there's 40, yeah, I'll spare the city." 30. God is indeed granting Abraham's petition. This type of reasoning, i.e., not for just one less, could go on until the number was down to 1, which was kind of what you were suggesting, John. So why then does Abraham stop at 10? And there's no clear answer to it.
Maybe respect, fear, respect.
That's true.
So the Lord left him.
That's true.
Maybe I'm
He did
afraid to go
say-
too far.
He
He
did
says, "I
say,
will speak just this once."
Yeah?
he
So
said
he
he
might
was
not have
very-
pressed it much more.
He said, I'm not gonna ask, I'll only do that one more time, like you said.
Yeah?
That's kind of a, I mean, if you tell God you're only gonna do it one more time, you better not be doing it more.
There's 3 possible reasons why Abraham stopped at that point, and all your comments are very valid here. But keep in mind, he's asked him this question a number of times already, okay? So in essence, he knew enough about the righteousness of God at this point, didn't he? And to know that anything below 10 is no longer an act of mercy to those few righteous who remain. So perhaps Abraham had enough knowledge of the flood, where only 8 were saved, to know that God had already made it a policy to not spare the wicked for less than 10. Or perhaps Abraham knew that any number lower than 10 would have degraded a worth intercession into narrow plea for one's relatives only. Those are some possible solutions. But the fact is, Abraham now knows enough that God is going to spare the righteous, period. Whether there's one righteous person in that city or whether there's 100, God will spare that righteous one. And this is what we're going to see a little bit later. Any comments up to this point?
Well, I was just thinking of all the people in the Bible who have bargained with God.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. But that's human nature for us to bargain. And in fact, on the judgment day, there's going to be many of us that will bargain. Well, Lord, I didn't know that you expected us to do that, even though you said so in the Bible. I thought maybe I could get by without doing it. And we're going to bargain. But then there's some that will have the faith of Abraham and not have to bargain because they already knew what was expected, and they did what was expected. And that's what we see throughout the book of Genesis. We see righteous individuals. So we're actually going to skip down now. We're not going to look at, like capital letter M in yours says the question of Genesis 18:25 could be made into a statement of fact. The judge of all the earth shall do right. Then you could look at capital letter N and capital letter O. But I'm going to skip all the way down to verse 33. And
Before, I was just going to mention that
yes.
Abraham humbled himself and said, I am but dust and ashes. So he's already saying, as he's about to ask God, I'm not really worthy to ask this in the first place, but I'm going to, I am but dust and ashes. So I think that's interesting too.
It is. Let's see, Debbie, I think it's your turn to read, isn't it?
Yes.
Read verses 32 and 33 for me.
Then he said, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak but once more. Suppose 10 should be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. So the Lord went his way as soon as he had finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place.
Okay. So all I want to say here is the report of a character's returning to his place or home is a formal convention for marking the end of an episode in biblical narrative. Having established now that the judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah is just, God now leaves Abraham. Okay? He's entered into discussion with Abraham, and Abraham sees that he is a righteous God, that he is a fair God, and so there's no more discussion to be had about Sodom and Gomorrah. So God is now leaving Abraham at this point. Any comments through chapter 18? Yes, John.
Already know that?
Do what?
Didn't Abraham already know that?
He did, but this was a confirmation of all of it. God has been with Abraham a couple of times and made promises, and Abraham has seen that those promises have come true. But keep in mind, there's one promise that's made here that hadn't happened yet. And that was a promise that Abraham would have a child by Sarah. Huh?
Two promises.
What's the other promise?
That all nations would be blessed by him, through him.
Well, that's true. That would be the second part of that promise. So, yes, Maxine.
I think it's interesting that it showed God's patience
Absolutely.
with Abraham.
Absolutely. Well, and it's there for us, too, to demonstrate God's patience with us as well. When you think about it, God desires that all men be saved. And Abraham, being created in the image of God, his desire was that all men be saved too, all righteous men. And so these were the reasons for Abraham's questions. And we see God's patience as God is patient with mankind today, desiring that all men be saved. And so he's very patient and long-suffering.
Maybe his questions were not ones of not trusting in the Lord. I mean, like I would see the Lord not getting so impatient because it's not really about trusting Him anymore. It's just about what are you going to do, you know. It's asking for direction of what's going to happen, not asking, you know, not doubting that He's going to follow through.
Right, yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts? All right, that concludes chapter 18. Took us a little longer to get through 18 than I had planned, but this is good that we have all of these discussions. Let's just look at the introduction of chapter 19. This is on page 45 of your handout, and I used the same topic there that he used, that Eskew used, judgment by fire. The title of Genesis 19, he had three titles: judgment by fire, Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed, the end of cities consumed by iniquity. And he used verses 24 and 25 of chapter 19 as the key verse. And the reason being, in these two brief verses, the Lord describes the judgment that came upon Sodom and Gomorrah, and these verses reveal the totality of the judgment. So that brings us to the lessons from Genesis 19. So let's look at that first. And keep in mind that Genesis, the book of Genesis, is a history of the chosen people and the messianic line. So why this episode, which has nothing to do with either? Okay? Talking about chapter 19 here. And the answer is that it was to teach the chosen people a lesson. Go back and look at verse 19 of chapter 18. It says, "For I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him." What we're going to see in chapter 19, it has nothing to do with the messianic line. It has nothing to do with the chosen people. But indeed, it is to teach a lesson to the chosen people. Yes, John?
Even the chosen people's not here yet.
That is correct.
Even Isaac isn't here yet.
That is correct. And they will hear this later on, as you had already mentioned. Beyond that, though, it is a type of the final overthrow of the wicked and deliverance of the righteous in the final judgment. Look at 2 Peter chapter 2 and verses 6 through 9. John, you have that? Would you please? And then, Pat, I'll ask you to read Jude verse 7.
Peter 2, 6 through 9.
Yes, please.
"In turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ash, condemned them and overthrew, making them an example unto those that after should live ungodly, and delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked, for that righteous man dwelling among them, and seeing and hearing, vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds. The Lord, knowing how to deliver the godly out of temptations, and to preserve the unjust unto the day of judgment, to be punished." Okay, and then Jude verse 7.
"As Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, in a similar manner to these, having given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire."
Okay, now first off, I want you to see what Pat read in verse 7, or Jude verse 7. It wasn't just Sodom and Gomorrah that was destroyed, was it? It was the cities around Sodom and Gomorrah. So you can imagine just how wicked this area had become. And God destroys the wickedness. But you look at 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 6 through 9, and God specifically spared the righteous out of this sinful area. You go all the way back to Abram and Lot when they left their homeland. God told them to get out of their homeland and come to a land which I will tell you or show you later on. Abram and Lot were faithful people, faithful servants of God. His parents, their relatives, were idolater worships. God was getting them out of that evil atmosphere. God gets His children today out of evil atmosphere when we gather together and we encourage one another. But when we stay in the world and everything, we're kind of like the parable of the tares. You remember that parable? Where they were told to let the tares grow up with the wheat, and then when they were mature you could separate the two. Well, the same thing. God is going to separate the good from the evil later on. And that's kind of the idea here that we're going to see in chapter 19. It has nothing to do with the chosen people nor the Messianic line, though. So, that was our fourth bell. So we're going to have to stop here now, and we'll get into chapter 19 next week. I appreciate your comments and your participation tonight.
Is this verse 7, is it talking more about the cities around them or them?
Well, it's talking about Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them. All were destroyed.
It almost sounded like they're talking more about the cities around them.
But it did.
Read it out loud to me. And let me hear somebody else read
Okay,
it.
let me go over there.
It's verse 7.
Give me just a second here, and I'll be there. All right, Jude in verse 7 specifically says, as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them in a similar manner to these, having given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire.
I got it. I didn't use that comma real good.
19 and 24 says, then the Lord rained upon Solomon and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the plains and all the inhabitants of the cities that which grew around on the ground.
Okay.
So
And that was which verse?
19, 24, and 25 says he got the whole plains around them too.
In Jude 7.
No, Genesis.
Oh, in Genesis.
19.
Yeah, okay.
And then you read a little further and it says he got the cities around them also.
Right, yeah. And we're going to get to chapter 19 next week. I appreciate you reading that, John. I thought you were in Jude, and I was trying to